When three ex-convicts abduct an actress to broadcast a live adult film, they're confident they'll make themselves rich. Unbeknownst to them, their wicked scheme backfires. During the filming of a sensual scene, Candy Taylor, a famous actress, refuses to bear herself in the camera. Because of this, Ross, the director, informs her they must reshoot the particular scene. He complains that the scene isn't working since she's overly protective of her chest. Candy emphasizes that her contract disapproves of bareness, but Ross still wants her to loosen up. In the end, Candy swears to make her acting more convincing. After the shoot, Candy's on her way home, oblivious that Fred Dowd, a con artist, is tailing on her. Upon reaching her residence, Fred hides in the bushes and records Candy as she enters her house. A car suddenly arrives and Frank, Candy's manager, gets out of the vehicle, leading Fred to find a different hiding spot. Frank and Candy talk outside where she expresses her desperation for more projects since she's going broke. Sadly, Frank can't guarantee her anything, especially since her problems rooted in her entanglement with the IRS. Moments later, Fred goes home to plug his camcorder into his television when a fellow ex-convict, Brad Vorman, surprises him. The pair exchange hugs, and Brad quickly asks why he's called him. Fred simply answers that he wants to see his old friend and also to offer him a job. Immediately, he plays Candy's footage from earlier and informs Brad that he plans to abduct her. Brad inquires how much ransom Fred wants, but he tells him there'll be none as they'll earn much more in another way. At first, Brad is skeptical, thinking it's too good to be true, but Fred guarantees him he's sure of everything. Following their conversation, the pair drives to a shabby neighborhood to meet Walt Gearson, their other accomplice. Fred introduces Walt as a genius, but Brad is guarded around him. Therefore, Fred suggests that Walt prove his capabilities. Once inside Walt's house, he immediately sits in front of his makeshift computer, and Brad proceeds to ask about his criminal past. When Walt curtly reveals he committed electronic embezzlement, Fred gladly elaborates that Walt stole millions of dollars from the US Treasury Department. Brad remains unimpressed and impatiently wonders why they need Walt for Candy's abduction. Excitedly, Fred reveals that he plans to exploit Candy by making her perform a live indecent act on the internet. This stuns Brad, but his curious mind asks how they'll set it up. Walt explains that he'll introduce a pop-up ad that shows a live image of Candy through the various servers he infiltrated worldwide. If the viewers successfully click the ad, Walt supposes the hits on their website will triple for about 18 seconds. Since the ad's a teaser, the viewers must pay $10 to see the rest, ensuring they'll earn a minimum of $2.7 million each. Fred emphasizes that the money they'll earn will be higher than any ransom. Now intrigued, Brad inquires how they'll acquire the money without getting caught, so Walt tells him they'll use encrypted codes. Brad is curious how Walt will prevent the authorities from tracing all of them back to him. Walt tries to explain, but his choice of words is too technical to understand, so Fred explains in his stead. According to him, the source code will be scattered, making it difficult for the authorities to trace them quickly. By the time they finish, they're already gone. Later that night, Walt visits his son Danny to bond with him. However, his ex-wife Barbara sends Danny to bed because she has an important matter to discuss with him. Walt informs her he's working on something to provide for their son. With this information, Barbara wonders if she can expect child support from him soon, but Walt just assures her he'll be involved. Unfortunately, Barbara hopes his alleged investment will be good enough to sustain Danny's medical needs. Upon seeing the results, Walt suggests they take Danny to a free clinic, but Barbara disagrees as their son needs major surgery. He tries to insist on how beneficial his investment will be, but Barbara is tired of hearing his story. For her, it's just another scam that'll ruin their lives. One night, the trio executes their attack wherein Brad and Fred successfully barge inside Candy's residence. The pair head straight to her bedroom, but when they approach her, Candy awakens. She tries to protest, hurting Brad in the process. However, Fred covers her mouth with a towel doused with chloroform, sedating her. Shortly after, the pair put Candy inside their getaway van and quickly flee the scene. On the road, Brad tries to touch Candy, but Fred chastises him. Disappointed, Brad confronts him for interfering, but Fred orders him to leave if he wishes to deviate from their plan. When Brad remains stubborn, Walt tells him he can have any woman he wants if they acquire the money. Begrudgingly, Brad stops acting on his twisted desire. The next morning, Candy awakens, but since she's blindfolded, she becomes frantic. Before she can make a noise, Brad intimidates her with his gun. She proceeds to ask what they want, and Fred proposes they want to do business with her. Candy admits she's broke, but Fred clarifies they're not after her money. Instead of revealing it, Fred negotiates with her that if she remains docile with him for 48 hours, they won't hurt her. Suddenly, Walt alerts them of the sheriff's presence, so Brad threatens to shoot Candy if she makes any unwanted sounds. Now, Fred orchestrates a plan to deceive the sheriff by pretending they're just friends who want to fish on the lake. Fred sedates Candy using the chloroform and settles her on his shoulder, making it appear she's just fallen asleep on her lover. Agitated, Brad declares he'll shoot the sheriff if he makes one wrong move. When Fred warns him, he eventually puts down his gun. The sheriff approaches them, causing Brad to hide his gun. Walt deals with him and the sheriff asks for his license. However, he refuses to give it, reasoning that their van is a rental. Walt provides the sheriff with the proof, and the man scans the document. He doesn't find anything suspicious about it, but rather the fact that there's a sole woman with them. Effortlessly, Fred lies that Candy is his girlfriend and she's just tired. After encountering the sheriff, the ex-convicts take Candy inside an abandoned ranch house. Brad harshly settles her to the bed, causing her to sob. To stop her from making more noise, Brad threatens to shoot her. Fred bounds her to the bed and assures Candy their activity will be over as long as she is cooperative. Parched, Candy begs Fred for water, but he doesn't immediately comply. Instead, he orders Brad to tell Walt to move the van away from the road. Now alone with Candy, Fred finally gives her water. In the living room, Brad tries to help Walt prepare his equipment, but he stops him. Walt suggests that Brad should take care of their video setup. He accepts, but he informs him of Fred's orders about the van. A little while later, Walt moves the van into the woods, but he can't shake the feeling of being watched. Therefore, he quickly returns to the house and looks out the window with great alarm. His sudden odd behavior bothers Brad, so he confronts him. Walt tells him he feels like there's someone outside, so Brad pulls out his gun and plans to find the possible visitor. Before he can leave, Fred appears and asks him what's going on. Brad reports about Walt's hunch of another presence, but Fred assures them there's no one since they're in a secluded area. Still, Walt refuses to be complacent, hypothesizing the house's owners might come back. Again, Fred denies the possibility since the owners are already deceased and the property is in probate. This time, Brad brings up the sheriff from earlier, making Fred eventually yield. Outside, Brad and Walt discover a man near the lake. Walt wants to leave him alone, believing he's harmless. Brad remains untrusting of the visitor, so he declares to end his life stealthily. In a span of seconds, Brad successfully takes care of the possible threat to their mission. Walt is visibly disturbed by his actions, but Brad chastises him for his cowardice. Then, he orders Walt to help him dispose of the body. Upon returning to the house, Brad tells Fred they didn't see anyone outside and silently threatens Walt with his gun if he snitches on him. Surprisingly, Fred believes Brad's lies and simply urges the pair to finish their setup. Moments later, Fred takes a frightened Candy into their bedroom setup, and the woman profusely reminds them she's broke. Fred removes her blindfolds and she scans the area, arriving at the conclusion her abductors want to film a movie with her. Contrary to her assumption, Brad clarifies she'll star in an adult film rather than a typical one. Fred gives her the script and the woman starts to protest. Annoyed, Fred threatens to make her stay miserable if she doesn't comply. Brad interjects, telling her they just want the money from the film. Still, Candy remains frightened, admitting she's never good at intimate scenes. However, Brad doubts her claims, especially since most of her roles are sensual. Candy remains uncooperative, leading the pair to subdue her. Out of fear, Candy agrees to stay docile, but Brad becomes skeptical about proceeding with their operation. Hence, he invites Fred to have a serious conversation outside. Brad confronts Fred about the possible outcome of their scheme, especially since Candy appears distraught about the whole operation. In Fred's defense, no woman will immediately submit to people who coerce her to make an adult film. Despite this reason, Fred assures him that he's planned everything. Regardless, Brad threatens to end his life if their operation fails. Back in their house, Fred pressures Candy to accept their deal by using her sick father. He tells Candy his father's nurse, Jimmy, is his friend. Then, he threatens he'll order Jimmy to refuse to administer her father's medication. As proof, he contacts Candy's father, and she learns that Jimmy is indeed his new nurse. This angers Candy, but she concludes that she has no choice but to accept their deal. Though Fred and Brad favor her response, Walt leaves, voicing that involving a sick person was not part of their agreement. Because of this, Fred reprimands Walt for backing out. Walt despises the idea of killing Candy's father. With a laugh, Fred explains that her father isn't in danger as everything's merely a bluff to convince Candy. Once Walt's assured, the pair returns inside just in time to stop Brad from taking advantage of Candy. This leads them into an argument as Brad complains about Fred's frequent interference. Fred asserts they're moving according to their script, and he must stick to their plan. Before a fight ensues, Walt intervenes and chastises them, saying they must begin their operation. Candy finally agrees to their arrangement, but she wishes to choose her partner for the film. At first, Brad disagrees, but she asserts she'll be comfortable with the man she'll choose. Without inhibitions, Candy chooses Fred, disappointing Brad. During the teaser's broadcast, Candy impressively acts as a seductress and surprises her fans with her vulgar proposition. She invites them to watch her live adult film with a service charge of only $10. After broadcasting the teaser, Fred checks on their progress, but Walt can't resist criticizing Brad. For him, Brad is dangerous, and Walt believes he'll be their downfall. Fred denies his assumption, especially since Brad is a thief and just a little aggressive. Walt acknowledges this, but he insists he keeps Brad away from him. To assure Walt, Fred urges him to keep doing his job while he promises to keep an eye on Brad. At that moment, Brad appears and confronts Fred for his words. Fred pretends they didn't talk about anything and orders him to light up the candle for their setup. However, he refuses, leading Fred to apologize for being bossy to him. Then, Fred takes the honor of doing the task, and Brad accepts his apology. He's glad to hear his words, so he promises not to be controlling of their operation. Moreover, Fred offers that if Brad wishes to end their scheme, he'll gladly accept it. Brad dismisses his proposition as he's keen on earning the money. Later that day, Walt visits Candy's room and assures her he'll not hurt her. He explains that he has no choice but to participate in the operation since he wants to acquire money for Danny's operation. All of a sudden, Candy experiences numbness in her left hand, so Walt slightly loosens up the rope. Not able to resist the urge, Walt excitedly tells Candy how surreal it is that he's sitting beside her. He reveals he's watched all her movies, but Candy's bitter knowing they'll exploit her through her adult film broadcast. This stuns Walt, leading him to apologize to her emotionally. Shortly after, the ex-convicts watch news coverage about Candy's promise of a live broadcast of her indecent performance later. Of course, this goes in Fred's favor as they still consider this free publicity to garner views. At the time of the broadcast, Walt experiences technical difficulties as the viewer's deposits have yet to be reflected on his tracker. As a consequence, Fred and Brad start to doubt his capabilities. Thankfully, Walt's figured out the problem by successfully registering the program. Immediately, loads of money flood the tracker, leading Fred to start the show excitedly. Throughout the broadcast, Candy performs impeccably, guaranteeing the ex-convicts their millions. After the deed, Brad commends Candy, but he quickly declares he wants to take his turn. Candy refuses to sleep with him, so Fred scolds him. Brad tries questioning Candy's refusal, but Walt alerts them about their earnings. Upon checking, Fred is triumphant for they've earned $13.3 million, higher than anticipated. On the other hand, Candy isn't as enthusiastic since she wants to go home. Unfortunately, Fred tells her they plan to send her home at night as it'll be safer for them. When Fred settles Candy back in her room, he returns to the living room and checks if they've already been tracked. Walt dismisses the idea, and he assures him he's got everything under control. Out of curiosity, Brad wonders how they'll acquire the money, and Walt explains they'll need the password to access the offshore accounts. Feeling as if he's being left out, Brad begins to become hostile. He insists on getting his share, and Walt shows him a CD that contains the password. Brad tries to snatch it, but Walt quickly takes it away. With a laugh, Fred tells Brad to be more trusting since they're partners. Moving on from the topic, Fred orders them to start cleaning up the place. Instead of complying, Brad expresses his displeasure that his share is still on hold. Walt senses his growing distrust, so he expresses his dislike for him. Despite this, he calmly reminds him to clean up their mess first. With that in mind, Brad declares his plan to eliminate Candy, but Walt disapproves. He believes she won't snitch on them since she doesn't know their faces. Not backing down, Brad refuses to be complacent as the police will lock them for a long time once they've discovered their crime. He threatens to end Walt's life if he ever gets in his way. At that moment, Fred appears and he strikes Brad from behind. Now that Brad's unconscious, the pair work together to restrain him. Walt asks if he knows that Brad plans to eliminate them all, and Fred confirms. Since they're already on the topic, Walt reveals that Brad's actually killed the man in the woods. Fred acknowledges his revelation, making him realize the reason for the bloodstains on Brad's shirt earlier. Afterward, they drag Brad's body into a room and lock the door. Fred leaves Walt for a bit as he'll check on Candy. Unbeknownst to them, Brad has gained consciousness and uses the doorknob to remove the rope around his wrist. In the living room, Fred returns and discusses his escape plan with Walt. He orders him to guard the door while he loads their getaway van. Unsatisfied with how how they've dealt with Brad, Walt asks about his fate, and Fred declares they'll kill him. While Walt guards the door, Brad picks on the lock using a wire. Once it's unlocked, Brad grabs Walt from behind and subdues him. Fred overhears the commotion, urging him to return inside. He heads straight to Candy's room just in time to stop Brad from taking advantage of the woman. An intense fight ensues between them, and Fred takes the upper hand. However, Brad's able to fight back and he slams Fred's head in the mirror, rendering him unconscious. Thinking there's no one to stop him, Brad threatens to shoot Candy. Thankfully, Walt comes to her rescue as he hits Brad's head with a bottle. Though weak, Walt removes the rope from Candy's wrists and helps her escape. Upon descending the stairs, he informs her that he plans on using the money to help his son. But before they can get inside the van, Brad appears and fatally shoots Walt. Candy has no options left. Therefore, she tries to seduce Brad as a way to escape. Initially, Brad gives in, but it's actually a farce. He grabs Candy's hair and chastises her for trying to make a fool out of him. As Brad continues to yap, Candy grabs the crowbar beside her and strikes him with it. Immediately, Candy runs away, trying to find a place to hide. Good thing she finds a nearby stable, so she quickly enters it. When she hears Brad pounding on the door, Candy grabs a pitchfork and hides. Brad enters through the window and searches for Candy. To distract him, Candy throws a horseshoe on the hayloft. Brad quickly climbs the ladder, allowing Candy to stab him with a pitchfork. Candy sprints out of the stable and gets inside the van. At that moment, Brad appears and tries to shoot Candy. Unfortunately, his bullets miss, and Candy runs him over with a vehicle. Now that Brad's subdued, Candy contacts the authorities, reporting she's been abducted and needs rescuing. After that, she gets out of the van and grabs Brad's gun from the ground. When she tries to finish him off, Fred appears, surprising her. She happily hugs him, relieved he's still alive. A dying Brad is baffled by their sudden closeness. He realizes that Candy isn't as innocent as she appears since she is also part of the scheme. Gladly, Fred reveals he's known Candy for a year. Since she needs money and a boost to her career, she's created the operation and conspires with him to make it a reality. Curious, Brad wonders how he met her. Fred informs him they first encountered each other at a recovery center. From then on, they formed a connection and even shared a few passionate nights. Angered, Brad asks why he involved him in the scheme, so Fred coldly reveals he's the pawn to make the operation convincing. He clarifies that Brad will be framed for the killings. With their revelation, Fred immediately shoots Brad. However, the sheriff arrives just after he's fired the gun. Not wanting to blow her cover, Candy betrays Fred by pretending he's her abductor. For this reason, the sheriff fatally shoots Fred. A few days later, Adrian, the talk show host, interviews Candy about her abduction. It turns out that with her fabricated story as a survivor of abduction, she garnered numerous Hollywood deals, making her a millionaire. Moreover, she makes the public believe that her previous financial difficulties are just rumors. One interesting thing she has done is that she deems Walt a hero for helping her escape. She adds that Walt is pressured to participate in the scheme since he is a provider for his family. Adrian commends her actions, especially because she's paid for Danny's operation. Later that day, Candy enjoys a glass of wine while she gloats at the $13.3 million earnings from the abduction scheme. With how things have turned out, she deems herself remarkable.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.